Richard Feynman was a giant of the 20th century. He was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, but to me, he exemplified the kind of person I aspired to be through his humility and his humanity. I first learned about him as a teenager, reading Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, which is a book written by Ralph Leighton, who was one of his closest friends as well as one of his drumming partners. And it was based on a series of stories that were tape recorded that Feynman would tell. Despite being a genius, Feynman didn't take himself too seriously. He didn't worry about what other people thought of him, which is why he would pursue his interests as he saw fit. A good example was his interest in drumming. He fell in love with drums during his travels to Brazil in the 1950s when he was a visiting lecturer there, and he fell in love with the rhythms of samba and bossa nova. He learned to play the frigideira, which is some kind of steel pan kind of drum, and then he later learned the surdo, which is some kind of bass drum. And he even joined local musicians and ended up playing during Carnival with a samba band in the streets of Rio in front of his scientific colleagues, who were kind of shocked to see him on the streets of Rio with these Brazilians. He also didn't suffer vanity from academics, who he described as trying to appear superior through use of abstruse terms in their niche subjects. His thoughts on knowledge really affected my attitude as I became a scientist. He argued that the more one understood a subject, the better you should be able to explain it to people of any background and any level of knowledge or sophistication, from, in his case, peers in high-energy physics, to, say, grad students, to undergraduates, to high schoolers, and even to elementary students. Obviously, he would have to use different language and different explanations for those different levels, but he would argue that fundamentally you should be able to explain the concepts that you're working on to anyone if you really understood them. I also find it fascinating that he really understood people and their sometimes base motivations. This is exemplified by his activities on the Rogers Commission, a U.S. congressional investigation into the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. Supposedly the purpose of such a commission is to determine the cause of the accident. Feynman knew that in reality, no one wanted to assign the blame to an individual or to a company, even if they were at fault. For example, if you were to assign such blame, there would be real consequences. If a particular person at NASA was responsible, would they lose their job? Would their career end? If there were a specific supplier of a component, would that company lose its contract with the government? If that were to happen, would a congressman tied to that company lose a source of campaign funds? You may notice that in our lifetimes, most of the time when there's a complex situation in an investigation, there's never a clear answer as to what happened. In this case, Feynman dove deep into the shuttle's design and the events of the day, and he realized that this explosion happened because of the leakage of fuel from one of the booster rockets. Eventually, he determined that the leak was due to a faulty gasket on that in which an O-ring failed and allowed the fuel to leak. And that was because the launch happened at a temperature below the specified range that was acceptable for the space shuttle. So it was an unusually cold morning in Florida, and Space Command decided to have the launch despite the temperature. That was a flawed decision that led to the disaster. At the hearing, Feynman fully expected that the politicians would try to claim that the report that he and his committee had produced was faulty and could not be relied upon. The politicians on TV were challenging Feynman and how he could possibly assign the blame for an incredibly complicated project to a single component, such as the O-ring. And he was prepared for this kind of obfuscation. He actually brought an O-ring, the same O-ring that was on the gasket, and he demonstrated with a simple glass of ice water how the O-ring was flexible, and then by just dumping it into a glass of ice water for a few seconds, demonstrated that it was no longer elastic, which is exactly what led to the failure of that day. I was watching this on TV, and I had to smile to myself as the politicians were just left speechless. They had nothing to say. It was obvious that Feynman knew what he was talking about. For some reason, these thoughts about Feynman are combining with my thoughts about Zohran Mamdani, our new mayor of New York. While it's hard to imagine two people who are more far apart, Mamdani is the farthest thing from a scientist, and Feynman is possibly the farthest thing from a politician. They were both iconoclasts. And while I do wish the best for Mamdani, I do worry about him. And I guess that in thinking about Feynman, I hope that he might consider the way Feynman conducted himself with regard to his thinking. When Mamdani was running for vice president of the student body at Bronx High School of Science, he promised fresh squeezed juice for everyone daily. In a recent interview, he chuckled and admitted that he had absolutely no plan or intention of making that true if he was elected. Of course, he was just a teenager then, and he's now 34. But it worries me that he continues to insist on his campaign pledge of free buses for New Yorkers, even though he doesn't control the MTA and has been told that it just isn't possible. I'm wondering whether he's still fundamentally that snake oil salesman that he was in high school. I hope that he's not. My concern isn't that he keep his campaign promises. My concern is whether he has the humility to learn the job that he was elected to do. A job of mayor is essentially one that's more about delivering basic services like getting trash picked up and getting the snow removed than it is about doing a lot of campaigning and high-fiving. I hope that he will focus on promoting growth and success of New York businesses, that he'll help to provide the environment in which adequate housing stock is available to support the public and for future growth, and that he'll manage to maintain public safety and our educational system. I was encouraged to see a picture of Mamdani with his transition team, which was composed entirely of experienced women in government. I think it's a hopeful sign when a male leader, signals that he is going to listen to women. Maybe there's hope for him after all.